Before we begin, the story you are about to hear is based on real events. However, archival photos and video materials of this case have practically not been preserved in the public domain. The crimes occurred in 2004 in Yekaterinburg, and the documentation from that time was limited. Therefore, in this video I use atmospheric images and reconstructions to convey the mood and context of the story. All facts, dates, and details of the case are taken from official sources: court materials, publications from Kommersant, Komsomolskaya Pravda, and other reliable publications. This is a story about real people and real tragedies. I ask you to treat it with respect. So, let us begin. Introduction. February 2004. Yekaterinburg. A cold Ural winter, -20 degrees. Along the snow-covered streets of the Uralmash district, trams crawl. On their couplings, children. Hanging on the footboards, clinging to the handrails. This is called kolbasa, a free way of transportation for those who don't have money for a ticket. At this moment, two adults are stalking their victims. A married couple, a man and a woman. They introduce themselves as police officers. They stop children. They say, "Come with us to the station. You'll pay a fine." Children go with them. They're afraid to refuse. After all, they're the police. Some of these children will never be seen alive again. Today I will tell you the story of the married couple Mikhail and Olga Ostyakov, about how love turned into a nightmare, about the method they called the Tram of Death, and about two children who paid for this with their lives. Context, Yekaterinburg, 2004. To understand this story, you need to understand the time and place. Yekaterinburg, 2004. Post-Soviet Russia. The economic crisis is behind us, but its consequences are still felt. Especially in working-class neighborhoods, especially in Uralmash. Uralmash is an industrial district in the north of Yekaterinburg. Factories, panel 9-story buildings, poverty, crime. In the 90s, criminal gangs ruled here. By 2004, the situation had improved, but the district was still troubled. And here lived children. Thousands of children. Many had no money for transportation, so they rode on kolbasa, on the couplings of trams, hung on the footboards, jumped on the move. It was dangerous, but it was free. The police knew this, and they patrolled tram stops, caught children on kolbasa, fined them, took them to the station, called their parents. Children feared the police, feared fines, feared that their parents would find out and punish them. It was precisely this fear that the Ostyakov couple exploited. Method: the Tram of Death. Their method was simple and horrifying. They tracked children on tram couplings, stopped them, introduced themselves as police officers, showed some IDs, or simply spoke in a confident voice. "Police, documents." The child got scared. He knew he had broken the rules. He was afraid. "Come with us to the station. You need to pay a fine, or we'll call your parents." The child agreed, went with them, thought he was going to a police station, but they were not leading him to a station. They were leading him to a deserted place, to a park, to a forest belt, away from people, away from witnesses. And then the nightmare began. They beat the child, hit with fists, with feet, stripped him naked, took everything, money, jewelry, clothes, and then threw him into the snow. Naked, beaten, in -20 degrees, and left. The child died from hypothermia, from beatings, from cold, alone, in the snow, in the forest. This was the Tram of Death. Part 2. Who were the Ostyakov couple? Mikhail Ostyakov, Portrait of a Killer. His name was Mikhail Ostyakov. At the time of the trial in 2005, he was 24 years old, which means he was born around 1980 or 1981. He grew up in Yekaterinburg, Ural-Mash district. A working-class family, little money, many problems. Little is known about his childhood. Sources have not preserved details. But there is one detail that he himself used as justification at trial. Mikhail had an aunt. She worked as a tram driver. And one day a tragedy occurred. Under the wheels of her tram, a child died. A boy who was riding on kolbasa. The aunt was convicted. She served punishment. Mikhail knew about this, and at trial his lawyer stated, "My client received psychological trauma because of this story." He blamed children on trams for what happened to his aunt. That's why he took revenge on them. But the investigation did not believe this version. The investigation spoke of something else, about debts, about unemployment, about the fact that Mikhail urgently needed money, about the fact that children on kolbasa were easy victims. They feared the police. They went with him voluntarily. They were easy to deceive, easy to lead away, easy to rob. The investigation spoke of sadism, about the fact that Mikhail beat children beyond necessity, about the fact that he derived pleasure from their suffering, about the fact that he wore the clothes of murdered children, about the fact that this was not just robbery. This was murder for the sake of murder. By 2004, Mikhail was already an alcoholic, unemployed, lived in poverty, in a criminal environment. He had no future, no prospects, no conscience. Olga Ostyakova, Portrait of an Accomplice. She was 20 years old at the time of the trial in 2005, which means she was born around 1984 or 1985. Even less is known about Olga than about Mikhail. Sources have preserved almost no information about her life. We don't know where she grew up. We don't know what kind of family she had. We don't know how she met Mikhail. We can only assume that this happened in 2002 or 2003, before the crimes began. They lived together in the Ural-Mash district. Poverty, alcohol, unemployment. But we know one thing. Olga was not a passive victim. She was not a hostage of Mikhail. She was an active accomplice. She introduced herself as a police officer on equal terms with Mikhail. She stopped children. She led them to the forest. She participated in beatings. She wore the clothes of murdered children. She wore the vest of 13-year-old Alyona Fefilova. She wore the gold chain of this dead girl. Psychologists who study killer couples identify several types of dynamics in such relationships. Sometimes one partner dominates, manipulates, forces the other to participate in crimes. This was the case with Fred and Rose West in Great Britain. This was the case with Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. But sometimes both partners are equal. Both derive pleasure from cruelty. Both amplify each other's sadism. One doesn't stop the other. On the contrary, encourages. Most likely, Mikhail and Olga were exactly such a couple. He was older. He was the initiator. But she was not a victim. She was an accomplice. Voluntary, cruel, indifferent. They were both monsters. Partly 3. Crimes. Victims. Alyona Fefilova, 13 years old. Her name was Alyona Fefilova. She was 13 years old. She studied at school number 113 in Yekaterinburg. An ordinary girl, an ordinary family, an ordinary life. February 2004. Cold winter. Alyona was returning home. Maybe from school, maybe from a friend's. She was riding a tram, on kolbasa, hanging on a coupling. It was dangerous. But she had no money for a ticket. And at some point, 2 adults stopped her, a man and a woman. They said, "Police, you broke the rules. You'll come with us to the station. You'll pay a fine." Alyona got scared. She knew she had broken the law. She was afraid they would call her parents, that her parents would punish her. She agreed to go with them. She didn't know she was going to her death. They led her for a long time, led her farther and farther from people, from roads, from houses, to a park, to a forest belt, where there's no one, where no one will hear a scream. And then the nightmare began. They began to beat her. Mikhail hit with his fists. Olga did too. Alyona screamed, begged for mercy. But they didn't stop. They stripped her naked, took everything. Money, if there was any. The gold chain that her parents had given her, her vest, her shoes, everything. And then threw her into the snow, naked, beaten, a 13-year-old girl, in -20 degrees, and left. Alyona tried to get up, tried to call for help, but her body wouldn't obey. Beatings, cold, shock. She was freezing. Her consciousness was fading. She died alone, in the snow, in the forest, from hypothermia and beatings. Her body was found several days later. Parents searched, police searched, but it was already too late. Alyona Fefilova, 13 years old, student of school number 113. The first known victim of the Ostyakov couple. Dmitry Votintsev, 11 years old. His name was Dmitry Votintsev. He was 11 years old. He also studied at school number 113, the same school where Alyona studied. This is an important detail. One school, one district. Children knew each other. Maybe Dima even knew Alyona. Maybe he heard that she had disappeared. Maybe he was afraid, but he still rode on kolbasa because there was no choice, because there was no money for a ticket. And at some point, two adults stopped him too, a man and a woman, the same ones. Mikhail and Olga Ostyakov. Police, documents. You broke the rules. You'll come with us to the station. You'll pay a fine. Dima got scared. He was even younger than Alyona, 11 years old, a child. He couldn't refuse adults, especially the police. He went with them. He didn't know he was repeating Alyona Fefilova's last journey. They led him to the same place, to a park, to a forest belt, away from people, away from witnesses. And again the nightmare began. They beat him, stripped him, took everything he had. He probably had no money, maybe a few rubles, maybe nothing. But they took his clothes, his shoes, everything, and threw him into the snow, naked, beaten, an 11-year-old boy, in -20 degrees. Dima died just like Alyona, from hypothermia, from beatings, from cold, alone, in the snow, in the forest. His body was also found several days later. Family searched, police searched, but it was already too late. Dmitry Votintsev, 11 years old, student of school number 113, the second known victim of the Ostyakov couple. Connection between cases. Two victims, one school, one district, one method, one signature. The police should have established a connection, should have understood that these were serial crimes, should have started looking for the same criminals. But this didn't happen, or happened too late. Why? Maybe because it was 2004, because the police system was imperfect, because there was no unified database, because different investigators handled the cases, because no one connected the dots. Or maybe because these were children from poor families, children from Uralmash, children who rode on kolbasa, children whom the system didn't consider a priority. We don't know the exact answer. Sources don't indicate reasons. But the fact remains, the connection between cases was established only after the Ostyakovs' arrest, and by then, it was too late. Alyona and Dima were dead. Other attacks. Alyona and Dima are only those victims we know about, those who died, those whose names were preserved in case materials. But there were others. The court established that the Ostyakov couple committed numerous attacks on children: robberies, beatings, attempted murders. Some children survived, maybe because they managed to run away, maybe because the Ostyakovs didn't fully strip them, maybe because someone found them in time. We don't know their names, we don't know their stories, but they existed, and each of them could have become Alyona, could have become Dima. Part 4. The couple's double life. How they lived between crimes. Mikhail and Olga lived an ordinary life, at least so it seemed. They lived in the Uralmash district, in an ordinary apartment, in an ordinary building, among ordinary people. Neighbors saw them, met them in the entrance, greeted them, maybe even talked. But no one noticed anything, or didn't want to notice. They drank. Alcohol was part of their life. Maybe it helped them forget. Maybe it intensified their cruelty. They had no money. Mikhail didn't work. Olga didn't either. They lived hand to mouth, got into debt. That's why, according to the investigation's version, they started robbing children. But money wasn't the only motivation, because they wore the clothes of murdered children. Olga wore the vest of Alyona Fefilova, of a 13-year-old dead girl. She wore it, maybe every day. Maybe neighbors saw her in this vest, and no one knew it was the clothing of a murdered child. Olga wore Alyona's gold chain. She wore it around her neck, a piece of jewelry that parents had given their daughter, that Alyona wore on the last day of her life. This is not just mercantilism. This is not just poverty. This is sadism. This is absence of empathy. This is a coldness that's hard to imagine. They killed a child and wore her things as trophies. Psychology of the couple. Who's in charge? In killer couples, a question always arises: who's in charge? Who's the initiator? Who's the dominant one? Who forced the other to participate? Or are both equal? With Mikhail and Olga, it's not so simple. Mikhail was older. He was 24, she was 20. He was probably the initiator. He came up with the method. He tracked victims. He hit harder. But Olga was not a passive victim. She introduced herself as a police officer on equal terms with him. She led children away. She participated in beatings. She wore the clothes of murdered children. She didn't try to stop Mikhail, didn't try to save children, didn't try to run away, didn't seek help. She was an accomplice, voluntary, cruel. Psychologists call this mutual amplification of cruelty. When two people together become worse than each of them separately, when one encourages the other, when there's no one who could stop them, when there are no boundaries, no conscience, no empathy. Mikhail and Olga were such a couple. They amplified each other's evil. Part 5. Capture and arrest. Last attack, March 11th, 2004. March 11th, 2004. Another cold day in Yekaterinburg. Another hunting day for the Ostyakov couple. They went out into the streets, looked for another victim, watched for children on trams, on kolbasa, and found one. A girl, riding on a coupling. They stopped her. Same scheme. Police, documents. You'll come with us to the station. You'll pay a fine. The girl got scared. Agreed. Went with them. They led her aside, started demanding money. She had 13 rubles. Only 13 rubles. A negligible sum. Not even enough for a bottle of vodka. They took this money, and probably were going to do the same thing they did with Alyona and Dima: beat, strip, throw into the snow. But the girl managed to scream. The hero, a passerby. Nearby was a man, a passerby. Sources have not preserved his name, but he heard the scream, saw what was happening, and didn't walk past. He rushed to help, grabbed Mikhail, didn't let him run away, held him by force. Mikhail resisted. Olga tried to help him, but the passerby was stronger, or more determined, or simply knew he was doing the right thing. He held them both and delivered them to a guarded parking lot. There were guards there. There it was possible to call the police. They called a patrol. The police arrived quickly, detained the Ostyakov couple on the spot. This passerby saved the girl, saved her life, and stopped the killers. If not for him, the girl would have become the third victim, and the Ostyakovs would have continued killing. Evidence: dead girl's clothes. When the police examined the detainees, they discovered something horrifying. Olga Ostyakova was wearing a vest, an ordinary children's vest, but not her size. Too small, child-sized. The police officers became suspicious. Asked, "Where did this clothing come from?" Olga didn't answer, or lied. But the police checked, and it turned out this is Alyona Fefilova's vest, a 13-year-old girl who had disappeared several weeks ago, who was found dead in the snow. Olga was also wearing a gold chain. Alyona's parents identified it. It was their daughter's jewelry. Direct evidence, irrefutable. The clothes and jewelry of a dead girl on the killer. The police understood. Before them were not just robbers. Before them were murderers. Mikhail and Olga Ostyakov were arrested on the spot, taken to the station. Interrogations began. Part 6. Investigation and Trial. Investigation. Sources have not preserved details of interrogations. We don't know if the Ostyakovs admitted guilt immediately. We don't know what they said. We don't know if they repented. But we know the versions they put forward at trial. Mikhail's version: psychological trauma. His aunt worked as a tram driver. Under the wheels of her tram, a child died who was riding on kolbasa. The aunt was convicted. Mikhail experienced this and began to blame children on trams. He took revenge on them for his aunt's fate. Investigation's version: sadism and mercantilism. Mikhail needed money. He chose easy victims, children on kolbasa. They feared the police. They were easy to deceive and rob. But he didn't just rob, he beat them beyond necessity. He stripped them naked. He threw them into the snow. He derived pleasure from their suffering. The investigation didn't believe the version about revenge for aunt. Too convenient, too contrived. Psychiatric examination found both spouses sane. They understood what they were doing. They controlled their actions. They bore full responsibility. Trial, February 2005. The trial took place in February 2005. Sverdlovsk Regional Court. Judge, Igor Yermakov. Mikhail and Olga Ostyakov were charged under several articles. Article 105 of the Criminal Code, murder. Article 117, torture. Article 158, theft. Article 161, robbery. The court established the couple is guilty of murdering Alyona Fefilova and Dmitry Votintsev, guilty of numerous attacks on other children, guilty of robberies and torture. The sentence was harsh. Mikhail Ostyakov, 25 years imprisonment in a strict regime colony. Olga Ostyakova, 15 years imprisonment in a general regime colony. Total, 40 years for two. Victims' families were present at the trial. They cried. They demanded justice. Some shouted, "This is not enough. They killed our children." But the law was on the side of the sentence. The death penalty in Russia had been under moratorium since 1997. Life imprisonment was not provided for under this article. 25 and 15 years. This was the maximum. The Ostyakovs listened to the sentence without emotion. Sources don't indicate whether they repented, whether they asked for forgiveness, whether they cried. Most likely, no. Part 7. Conclusion and Analysis. Why weren't they caught earlier? 2 children from one school, 1 district, 1 method, 1 signature. The police should have established a connection, should have started looking for the same criminals, should have warned schools, parents, children. But this didn't happen. Why? Maybe it was the imperfect system of 2004, absence of a unified database, poor coordination between departments. Different investigators handled cases and didn't share information. Or maybe it was indifference. Children from poor families. Children who rode on kolbasa and broke rules. Children whom the system didn't consider a priority. We don't know the exact answer, but the fact remains, if the connection had been established earlier, Dmitry Votintsev might have been alive. Where are they now? Mikhail Ostyakov received 25 years. He was arrested in 2004, which means he will be released in 2029, in 4 years. He will be about 49 years old. Olga Ostyakova received 15 years. She was arrested in 2004. She was released in 2019, served her full term. She was about 35 years old. Where is she now? Sources don't indicate. Did she return to Yekaterinburg? Does she live under a different name? Does she remember Alyona and Dima? We don't know. Conclusions. The story of the Ostyakov couple is a story about how love can turn into a nightmare, how 2 people can amplify evil in each other, how absence of empathy can lead to monstrous crimes. This is a story about the phenomenon of killer couples, about how when 2 are together, they can become worse than each separately. One doesn't stop the other. On the contrary, encourages mutual amplification of cruelty. This is a story about systemic problems, about how the police couldn't establish a connection between cases, about how children from poor families were left without protection, about how the system's indifference cost lives. This is a story about heroism, about a passerby who didn't walk past, who took a risk, who stopped killers, who saved a girl. But above all, this is a story about 2 children. Alyona Fefilova, 13 years old. Dmitry Votintsev, 11 years old. Children who rode on kolbasa, who couldn't imagine that police could be more dangerous than a tram, who trusted adults and paid for it with their lives. Remember their names, remember their stories, and protect children, always.